Hi, everyone. We are really excited to have you here on this session called Climate Litigation and Legal Trends. And welcome to everyone to today's sessions. Welcome to this new session of Global Youth Climate Training Program. Please, let's go with the next slide. Thank you. Well, we want to be part of your learning process, so please share some insights on your social media and tag us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Yeah, don't forget to share your insights. We love to see your highlights, your stories, or your post about the session. And use our official hashtag UICT 2025. Let's go with the next slide, please. Well, today I will be moderating this session with Alexis McGivern, and I am part of UIC team. And my name is Bianca Malford from Bolivia. Hi, everyone. Again, remember to drink some water and maybe grab a snack. Well, hi, Alexis. Are you there?
Hey, Bianca. Yes, thanks so much. Thanks so much for opening our last content-focused session. So we're sad that it's nearly at the end of the training, but the way that we've structured it is to make sure we have lots of time between finishing now in July and when COP30 starts in November. So we have a bit of time to keep connecting and meeting each other on Slack and staying up to date with each other's updates. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks so much. So this content session is about litigation and legal trends. So we have three key objectives for today's session. The first is to understand the role of law in tackling climate change and the importance of climate science in law. So we'll have my colleague Rupert speaking on that in just a minute. The second is to understand the latest trends in climate litigation. And the final and maybe most important objective is to hear from campaigners who have been working on recent youth-led legal action around the world. So if we can just go to the next slide, please. We've got a really wonderful stacked session today with experts from all over the world. We're really grateful for their time to be joining us here today. And as always, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'd really love to see them. And with that, I'll hand back to Bianca to introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, Alexis, thank you so much for explaining our agenda and our objectives. Well, let's go with our first speaker. Please, the next slide. Well, this is our panel of speakers. Please, the next slide. Perfect. Our first speaker is Dr. Rupert Stewart Smith. He's Senior Research Fellow in Climate Science and the Law at the Oxford Sustainable Law Program. His present research interests cover the use and interpretation of climate science evidence in litigation and methodological developments in climate change attribution science. His research has been published in leading scientific journals, including Nature Geoscience and Nature Climate Change, and featured in the global media, including by The Guardian, Reuters, and Carbon Brief. So, welcome, Rupert. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction, Bianca and Alexis. It's wonderful to be with you all today, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This afternoon, my time at least, I'd like to share with you a few remarks about the role of the law in tackling climate change. In particular, I'm going to share with you how developments in climate science have empowered legal accountability in the context of climate change. Scientific developments have made it possible to argue that contributing to climate change through producing greenhouse gas emissions is not simply something that states and corporations may continue to get away with doing, but potentially they may be held legally responsible for the consequences of doing that. Developments in climate science also tell us how fast we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to prevent a worsening of climate change and its impacts, and if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to repeatedly come back to those two ideas throughout my talk today. But I'd like to start my talk high up in the mountains of Peru. These photographs were taken by the Austrian mountaineer and glaciologist Hans Kinzel. He, in the 1930s, took these photographs of Laguna Pacococha, a glacial lake, as I say, high up in the mountains that sits above the city of Huaraz, just below it. As you can see in the photograph, the glacier that sits in that valley is at the back end of the lake, it retreating over time, and in the wake of its retreat, this lake has formed. In the 1930s, this medium-sized lake was overspilling, as you can see in the photograph on the right. And tragically, in 1941, an avalanche from the glacier behind it most likely triggered a devastating flood. It caused a tidal wave to emerge from this lake, cascade down the valley to the city of Huaraz below it. And as it did so, it destroyed a substantial portion of the city, flooding houses, covering them in rock and mud. In this mid-20th century disaster, at least 1,800 people lost their lives. In the photograph you can see on your screens now, you see a substantial portion of the city, this big white scar across the center of the photo, still covered by mud and rock 6 years after this devastating event occurred. But the reason why I'm talking about this disaster that happened over 80 years ago is because the risk to the people of Huaraz has only got larger since then. As you can see on these photographs on your screen now, satellite images and aerial photography over the last 70 years or so, the glacier at the back end of the lake has retreated up the mountain by around 1 kilometer since that 1941 disaster. As the glacier has retreated, the lake has expanded. The lake is now substantially larger than it was in the 1940s. And the amount of water held within it that could once again flood the city is, as a result, far greater. For this reason, for 50 years, the local authorities have attempted to reduce the flood risk for the people of Huaraz. They've installed pipes to drain water from the lake and tried to lower the lake levels. But despite these efforts, modeling and scientific papers shows that if another flood were to occur, a substantial portion of the city would once again be flooded. The people would have at most about an hour's notice. So this huge lake sits high up above Huaraz, threatening to flood it. But the reason why we're talking about this particular circumstance in Peru is because of the gentleman in the center of your screen here. He's called Saul Luciano Luya. He is a farmer and mountain guide from Huaraz in Peru. And back in 2015, he went to court in Germany, arguing that RWE, the largest emitter in Europe, they should pay part of the costs of protecting the city. In essence, he argued, why should we, the Peruvian people, need to pay the costs of protecting a city from the effects of climate change if companies like this one are those who are responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that created this problem in the first place? So his case fundamentally hinges on this idea that it is climate change that's responsible for this flood risk in Peru, and then also that you could potentially hold a company like RWE operating on the other side of the world legally accountable for their contributions to these risks. Can scientifically we prove the link between emissions happening around the world and these climate change impacts happening in Peru? Well, a few years ago, with some colleagues, we set out to answer exactly that question. We did a study that assessed the contribution that human-induced climate change is making to changes in the climate in the area around the glacier in Peru, and then looked at the effect that changing climate has on the glacier and the resulting flood risk. What we found was pretty much all of the observed changes in temperature in that region are attributable to human influence in the climate. In other words, human burning of fossil fuels, animal agriculture, and other sources of greenhouse gas emissions, they caused this rise in temperatures, which in turn directly resulted in the retreat of this glacier. It could not have happened due to natural variability alone, and it was a direct cause of that human-induced warming. We then looked at the flood risk, and what we found was that this retreating glacier that has caused the massive expansion of this lake, well, that was a direct consequence of the retreating glacier and therefore of human influence on the climate. So scientifically, it's now possible to prove the link between greenhouse gas emissions and specific climate change impacts happening around the world. Where climate change is indeed responsible, usually we can demonstrate if that is the case. So this scientific evidence was available that demonstrated that, yes, indeed, there was this very strong link between climate change and this flood risk in Peru. But was that enough for the case to win? Well, we found out the answer to that question about 6 weeks ago. After 10 years of deliberating on this case, the German courts finally came out with an answer. They found that even though RWE was only responsible for about 0.5% of historical greenhouse gas emissions, they could still be held responsible for their contributions to climate change impacts happening wherever they happened around the world, not only in Germany. They found also that these climate change impacts, or climate change impacts of the type that were happening in Peru, they were foreseeable consequences of greenhouse gas emissions, at least since the 1960s. In other words, companies like RWE should have known that this might result from their greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a crucial part of the legal argument, because you have a much stronger case if you're able to demonstrate that you should have known that certain things were going to occur as a result of emissions, and therefore you have a responsibility to make sure they do not occur. RWE claimed that actually they had the right to emit. The governments knew about climate change. They did not render burning fossil fuels illegal. In fact, they actively regulated it. So governments had essentially made a decision that companies like RWE were allowed to emit within the bounds of these regulations. They said that should exempt them from liability, from legal responsibility for causing these impacts. The court said no. It doesn't matter that governments have regulated greenhouse gas emissions to some extent. You may still be held responsible for the consequences of those emissions. The court also found that climate change was an issue that the courts could rule on. Elsewhere in the world, some courts have said, climate change is this politically complex issue. It's up to governments to decide how fast emissions should be cut, or whether or not we hold companies responsible for contributing to the impacts of climate change. But this court in Germany said no. These sorts of issues can be handled by the courts, and we can decide whether or not to hold you responsible for causing these harms. So on the legal basis, this is a very, very strong decision. But ultimately, what the case hinged on was whether or not the risk to the claimant's house, that's the house of Mr. Luya, from this particular flood was sufficiently high. Mr. Luya doesn't actually live in the center of the area that may be worst affected by the flood. He lives a little bit away from the river. And in the view of the court, the risk to his particular house was not sufficiently high for them to rule against this company and to force them to pay up for the costs incurred to adapt to those impacts of climate change happening in Peru. So ultimately, the case was not successful in terms of awarding a payout and forcing this company to pay compensation to the people of Peru dealing with these impacts of climate change. But the case did set a groundbreaking set of legal developments that establish for the first time that companies can in fact be held responsible for contributing to climate change. If this were to result in successful claims in future and companies are held responsible for their contributions to climate change impacts, this could be a major step forward for climate justice. Now, this particular case would have only led to a relatively small amount of money being paid out. The claimant sought just about 20,000 euros in compensation. But if cases like these were to be widely successful, the consequences could be vast. One example is a case recently filed in the state of Oregon in the US. They seek compensation from a set of fossil fuel companies, in particular, for the impacts of climate change, in particular through extreme heat in the northwest of the US. And in this particular case, they seek over $50 billion in compensation for impacts that have already happened, and also to be paid into a fund to better deal with the impacts of climate change that will still happen in the future as a result of these companies' emissions. If cases like this were to be successful, this starts to change the financial equation in the context of climate change. It means that to contribute to the impacts of climate change is no longer something that companies can just get away with, but rather they could be held legally and financially accountable for their contributions to climate change. Apologies, I was just muted, but I believe I should still continue. And it also means that communities affected by the impacts of climate change may start to have access to justice as a result. And fossil fuel companies and other major emitters are responsible for vast consequences. About $60 trillion in damages from just 25 companies by one estimate. So successful cases like this could have vast consequences. But what is the role of climate litigation more generally? Climate litigation is brought in general in response to gaps in climate governance. In particular, the fact that on the one hand, we have a Paris Agreement, and we've got domestic climate laws, and on the other hand, most states and corporates' action in response to climate change is nowhere near enough. The status quo is that states are planning on producing far more emissions than they can if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And many of these cases argue that is in fact in contravention of domestic or international law. And because of that, they may be able to bring successful cases before courts, arguing that countries and companies are breaching obligations they have to their citizens. The other gap in climate governance is that there's no meaningful mechanism to compensate communities affected by the impacts of climate change. The Paris Agreement rules this out, and while there is a loss and damage fund that has now been set up as part of the UN climate process, at the moment, it's largely unfunded. It has a few $1 million in it, and it's not yet, to the best of my knowledge, paid out a penny to support communities dealing with the impacts of climate change. Maybe climate litigation provides a route to justice for those communities who are facing the impacts of climate change. In this context, more and more climate lawsuits have been brought around the world in recent years. Several hundred are now brought every single year, and overall, over 2,000 climate-related cases have been brought worldwide. These cases make a range of claims. Many of the cases seek to accelerate climate action, to challenge inadequate state or company climate targets, or the implementation of those targets, arguing they need to accelerate emission reductions and cut emissions faster. They seek to challenge new fossil fuel projects and other high-emitting projects. They seek compensation for the impacts of climate change, or they seek to challenge false and misleading statements from companies, for instance, through greenwashing. And these cases are supported by three key developments in climate science. In the last few years, it's become possible to demonstrate the impacts of climate change that have already occurred. We can demonstrate that individual companies and countries' greenhouse gas emissions are already causing climate change impacts. And when these impacts happen around the world, we can assess the extent to which they were caused by those greenhouse gas emissions, like the example in Peru. We can do this for weather events. We can ask how much stronger was a storm made by climate change? How much hotter was a heat wave made by climate change? And what were the humanitarian consequences of that? Climate projections allow us to understand how these changes will emerge in the future. Depending on how many emissions we produce in the years to come, we will see impacts of climate change, and we can quantify by just how much. And in so doing, we can provide a clear basis for climate-related legal claims, whereby it's possible to argue that accelerated emission reductions will avoid some of these worst impacts of climate change in the future. And the last area of climate science supporting these claims is mitigation science. With mitigation science, we can quantify just how many emissions we can produce if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and how fast we need to cut our emissions to stay within the Paris Agreement's goals of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, ideally to 1.5 degrees. So to conclude, developments in climate science provides a growing factual basis on which we can ground climate-related lawsuits. While these legal outcomes will not be the same in every country, and they will evolve over time, basing climate-related lawsuits in strong scientific evidence gives them the best chance of success. At the moment, we have a major gap in climate justice. Communities are dealing with the impacts of climate change that are no fault of their own most of the time, and they're not being compensated for it. We're also doing a terrible job of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement on the mitigation side of things. Emissions are far too high and they're not yet coming down. We need to cut emissions rapidly. And in many cases, especially in Europe, but increasingly elsewhere, courts have found that states are in breach of their legal obligations by failing to achieve exactly this. Only by preventing new fossil fuel infrastructure and cutting emissions fast can we keep the goals of the Paris Agreement alive. And this is something that lawsuits are increasingly potent tools to achieve. With that, I'll end my remarks here. And I apologize for slightly going over time. And I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rupert. That was such a compelling and really succinct summary of where and how climate litigation can be used as a tool for accountability. So thank you so much for giving us that really comprehensive overview, and also for all of your amazing work in this area. So really appreciate you and your time. Moving on to our second speaker, Zaki Mamdouh, we're delighted to have him join us today. He is the campaign coordinator for Stop ECOP. The campaign seeks to prevent the development of the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, ECOP for short, which would be the world's longest heated oil pipeline. Zaki is also the interim Africa regional campaigner at 350.org, a long-standing global campaign seeking to end fossil fuel use and transition to a renewable-powered future. Zaki, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Comrade Alexis, and thank you to everyone for joining, for inviting me to be on the platform, and of course to everyone here who's put yourselves forward and raised your hands in this ongoing struggle for climate justice. So as Alexis noted, my name is Zaki Mamdouh. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I coordinate the Stop ECOP campaign and coalition, which is a large Pan-African and internationalist coalition and campaigns set up to confront the construction of the East African crude oil pipeline project. And I'll share a bit more on that later. Please also, if I do go over time or if I'm going too fast, I'm not necessarily following the chat, so feel free to unmute, Alexis, and just let me know. I must premise my contributions by noting that my own work is grounded in organizing and in movement building, and not in legal practice per se. And I think while that certainly makes me a layman who cannot sufficiently tell you, the ins and outs of climate litigation strategies, the approaches, and the relevant case law, perhaps it is also exactly what qualifies me to speak here today. Because while I will speak about climate litigation, in the case of ECOP, my aim is to situate it clearly and honestly, and not as a silver bullet, not as a substitute for movement power, but as one tool among the many in the long, protracted struggle to defend life against a system that commodifies it and that consumes it. And so what I want to explore with you today is the central contradiction that underpins the theme of the seminar. And that is that the climate crisis is not simply a failure of regulation or the result of legal loopholes, but it is the consequence of a social and economic order that prizes accumulation over survival and which protects property over people, and really legalizes destruction while criminalizing resistance. And so from the very start, I think it's worth noting that while litigation is a necessary front of struggle, it is also an insufficient one. Without power behind it and without mass movements, democratic accountability, and political clarity, even the best legal victories can become symbolic gestures in the face of ongoing devastation and systemic brutality. And often it is that systemic brutality that will pay homage to the law if that law protects it, but will equally laugh in the face of the law if that law seeks to challenge it. So let's begin by grounding this discussion in a concrete example, which is the one that I work on day in, day out, and that is the Stop ECOP campaign. I think we can go to the next slide, Fred. So the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, or ECOP, is a proposed 1,443 kilometer long pipeline stretching from the Western Great Lakes region of Uganda through to the coast of Tanga in Tanzania. It is led by the mega fossil fuel multinational Total Energies in partnership with the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, or CNOOC, as well as the state-owned oil companies of Uganda and Tanzania, respectively. Now, the ECOP project, even before having been completed, has already displaced upwards of 100,000 people. It has threatened critical ecosystems, including Lake Victoria and the Murchison Falls National Park, and stands to unlock an estimated 34 million tons of carbon emissions annually at a time when, of course, we need rapid decarbonization. It would also open up the entire region to further exploration and exploitation. And we're already seeing the auctioning of 52 oil blocks in the eastern part of the DRC, as well as new exploration rights being granted along the border of Uganda and Tanzania. And the infamous dictator of Uganda, Museveni, has also publicly spoken about the potential of ECOP opening up further oil blocks in South Sudan. And so by all means, this project represents a textbook case of neo-colonial extractivism, which is characterized by profit for the few through the cheap export and privatization of unprocessed resources, and violence for the many through displacement, through livelihood loss, no benefit sharing, the widespread unraveling of the social fabric in frontline communities, and through arrangements which see host countries using their own revenues to repay debts, and of course to enrich a national political elite. Now, because we are confronted by this beast of a project, our campaign to stop ECOP is not only a legal endeavor, By all means, it is political, it is economic, it is moral, it is decolonial, and it is environmental. But litigation has played an important role in the broader strategy, and there are two cases worth noting here. The first is in France, where a group of Ugandan and French civil society organizations brought a case under the duty of vigilance law, which is unique to France and requires multinational corporations to identify and prevent human rights and environmental violations across their global supply chains. And the case argues that Total Energies has failed to do so in relation to ECOP. But critically, the case has faced significant procedural delays and jurisdictional challenges. And so years into the litigation now, the reality is that Total remains unrestrained and the pipeline is already under construction. The second noteworthy case is the one that was brought to the East African Court of Justice, where civil society organizations in Uganda and Tanzania filed a case challenging the approval process of ECOP on a whole multitude of different grounds, including public participation, environmental protection, and human rights abuses. And this case as well remains in limbo. It's been mired by procedural stalling, and with limited enforcement mechanisms available to the courts, even in the event of a favorable ruling, it's really uncertain what it would achieve at a material level. And so what these cases illustrate is not necessarily the importance of legal tactics, but it illustrates their limits. Despite really compelling legal arguments and despite extensive documentation of abuse, of displacement, and of ecological threat, the construction of ECOP continues, and communities are being uprooted, livelihoods are being lost, and by all means, a carbon bomb is being prepared. And so this experience of climate litigation and of legal challenges to major fossil fuel projects in the case of ECOP brings us to a deeper question, which is, well, what is the law? What is the law under capitalism? What does it protect, and who does it serve? And so let's go to the next slide, Fred. So I think it's important to point out that the law should not necessarily be seen as a neutral arbiter of justice, but really as an instrument of class power. It is part of the so-called superstructure, as sociology students would know, that is the set of political, legal, and ideological institutions that stabilize and reproduce the underlying economic base of society. Now, under capitalism, this means that we can understand the law as, or in terms of institutions that protect private property, that enforce contracts, and that legitimize the extraction of profits from labor and from nature as well. And so generally under capitalism, the law is shaped by and for the interests of capital. It protects the freedom of contract, even if that contract masks exploitation. Likewise, it defends private property, even if that property was acquired through dispossession. And it upholds the sanctity of investment, even when that investment leads to ecological collapse. In fact, there was a Russian heavyweight legal theorist, Evgeny Pashukanis, who argued that the legal subject itself, the idea of a person who owns, who transacts, and who bears rights is historically specific to capitalism itself. And in other words, we are all reduced to rights-bearing, contract-making individuals and are treated as legal subjects, even as the underlying relations are structured by domination and inequality. What this means is that the law itself cannot be separated from the exchange of commodities. Now, in the African context, this is intensified by histories of colonial law, of dispossession, and corporate capture. And what we see is that regulatory bodies like South Africa's Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, the DMRE, or the equivalents in Uganda and Tanzania and elsewhere across the continent, often function less as public watchdogs and more as facilitators of extraction. So officials, routinely in these institutions rotate between public office and corporate boardrooms. Likewise, environmental impact assessments are often reduced to rubber stamping exercises, and legal compliance becomes a performance and a way to legitimize what has already been decided by capital. And so we must confront the fact that the climate crisis is not happening in spite of the law. It is happening and has happened through the law. The construction of ECOP, despite legal challenges, is continuing as something that is perfectly legal. The issuing of licenses for further oil exploration in Tanzania, the auctioning of 52 oil blocks in the Eastern DRC, all of it is perfectly legal, despite the fact that the displacement of communities, the repression of defenders, and the threats to biodiversity hotspots, to Ramsar sites, and all of those things is utterly illegitimate. Let's go to the next slide. And yet, importantly, despite my cynicism, I think the story is not entirely fatalistic, because the law, like all institutions under capitalism, contains contradictions. The ideals embedded in liberal legality, the ideas of equality before the law, of protection of life and dignity, the public interest, and all of these things, can be mobilized and should be mobilized against capital. And even if that's only done temporarily, it can be really powerful. Rights-based arguments, constitutional claims, and international legal norms can be used to delay projects, to expose abuse, and to galvanize public support. For example, in the Netherlands, climate activists successfully sued Shell to reduce its emissions. In Colombia, courts have recognized the rights of nature. In South Africa, youth-led litigation has forced the government to defend its climate policies in courts, and all of these things. And they are very much important tactical victories. They can delay projects, they can expose lies, and they can shift public discourse and can produce real material victories and gains for impacted people. But the truth is also that they are rarely enforced in full, or are upheld for a time and subsequently then are eroded over time. And the gains that have been won are stripped away. And so part of the core problem here is that they never alter, these legal challenges, they never alter the underlying logic of capital accumulation, of private ownership, of centralized planning, and profits at all costs. And so another reality to be alive to is how corporations and the states who manage their interests increasingly weaponize the law in their own defense as well. So you'll find, for example, that through things like investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which are embedded in trade agreements between countries, multinationals can sue governments for lost profits if environmental regulations reduce their returns. And so legal accountability becomes a one-way street, and governments are made to bend the knee to the interests of capital. And so the question here is not whether or not we should litigate, but the question is, how do we litigate strategically? How do we avoid technocratic depoliticization? How do we avoid NGO capture? And how do we avoid legal fetishism as well? How do we use the courtroom not as a destination, but as a platform to organize, to educate, and to build power? Next slide, please. So I've added here some tools and tactics which are available to movements who would seek to use legal intervention strategically. And just some bullet points on the limits and opportunities here. I'd encourage comrades, of course, I'm not going to get into this in much detail in the interest of time, but I'd encourage comrades to engage this further and to explore the rationale which informs these approaches and where they may work, as well as where they would fall short or create additional risks. And yeah, I'm not going to dive into it too deeply, but I think the point that can be drawn out from this table and from all of these approaches, and which is really the truth at the heart of the matter, is that it is movements who make the law matter. Let's move to the next slide. Now, any diligent student of history will confirm that there is no meaningful right that we have as people, whether it is to vote, to strike, to organize, or the right to live free from environmental harm. None of those meaningful rights have ever been granted from above. It has always been the case that they have been fought for, they have been demanded from below, and they have been won through collective struggle. Now, litigation, when it is grounded in movement organizing, can become a weapon of exposure and delay. It can buy us time. It can win us narratives and moral authority. It can split our enemies and recruit our allies. It can even win material gains, like things like benefit sharing, compensation, reparations, etc., etc. But it cannot substitute for mass mobilization, nor can it overcome a legal order which at its core is designed to protect capital. And likewise, any victories that are won through the courtrooms often require movement backing to ensure that they are upheld and that they are properly adhered to, and to ensure that they are not simply eroded over time, which requires, of course, sustained pressure on the part of movements. So that's why the Stop EACOP campaign emphasizes people's power. It places its priorities and its focus on mass action, on cross-border solidarity, on community resistance, and even the building of democratic alternatives. Because we cannot afford to be naive enough to romanticize the law, but we also cannot be so naive as to abandon it. And so we try our best to engage it, but to engage it on our own terms as one front in a broader war for survival. Let's move to slide 7. So as much as we must utilize the tools available to us to exploit the opportunities and to draw out the contradictions of legality under capital, I think we must also confront the idea that if the institutions of today cannot serve life, then there is a responsibility on us and on the movement that we form part of to imagine and build the institutions that will. And this is where the concept of dual power comes into play. And to touch on it briefly, it's just worth noting that it is not about service provision where the state may fail, but it is the political practice of constructing an alternative reality, one which, if ideally movements get it right, is rooted in collective care, in autonomy, in solidarity, and all of these things. Now, when we take up the responsibility to build these alternatives, movements also become more than resistors, but rather we become authors of a future society. And this is where the radical imagination becomes material. We are not simply reforming systems, but we are inventing the grammar of a life in which oppressive systems can no longer exist, and are building up our confidence to fight for that life and organize society on our own terms. Now, in the realm of law, dual power can often shape up in the form of things like people's tribunals and alternative legal forums, which are, more than symbolic gestures. While they don't have state backing behind them, they are still acts of legal imagination, right? They are exercises in building a jurisprudence, which is grounded not in capital, not in the nation state or in colonial authority and power relations, but which is grounded in popular sovereignty, in ecological ethics, in indigenous knowledge, and in restorative and reparative justice. And so in this sense, dual power in law means inventing processes of justice that are external to economic reproduction. So they are not shaped by the logic of investment risk, by the logic of corporate profits or elite interests. And so these spaces, things like the People's Health Tribunal or the Rights of Nature Tribunals or the upcoming Future Generations Tribunal, help us name and frame the harms that bourgeois legality either cannot or refuses to recognize. But it's also worth noting that these processes of building alternative institutions don't only operate outside of the formal system, they can also strengthen legal efforts within it. And there's a number of ways that they can do this. The first is by gathering testimony and evidence that movements can submit to courts, by mobilizing public consciousness, creating pressure around legal cases, by asserting a moral legitimacy that courts often lack, and raising the cost of inaction, and by asserting, community-defined standards of justice. They offer benchmarks for progressive judges and legal scholars to draw from as well. I see you on camera, Alexis. I am wrapping up, if you'll indulge me.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
So these forms of people's law really act as a legal counterpower. They remind courts that if they will not deliver justice, then others will. And so they have the potential to reshape the field of legality itself, especially if they are backed by movement energy and by mass legitimacy. So in this way, dual power in law is not just oppositional, it is generative. It builds parallel forms of justice while deepening, the social and political terrain on which even bourgeois legal efforts must operate. Let's move to the final slide, and then I'll conclude here. And so just to conclude, litigation will not save us, but it can serve us if we stay clear-eyed about its limits and if we remain rooted in the power of organized struggle. When we lead with movements and not with court mandates, even the courtroom can become a site of confrontation, of education, and of resistance itself. And so we should be clear that the law as it stands cannot deliver climate justice. It is too often constrained by the same forces that drive the crisis itself. Those are the forces of private property, of capital accumulation, and of colonial logic and power relations. But people can deliver justice, and people can build it. And when we wield legal tools strategically, critically, and politically, we may just bend them appropriately. And even if it's briefly, it may serve us in serving the struggle itself. And so we should reject both fatalism and liberal legalism in favor of a fight which is waged on all fronts, in the courts, but also in the streets, through policies, but also in popular assemblies, in the legal codes, but of course also in the radical imagination. Let me leave it there, comrades. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Taki, for the amazing and important talk. There are a number of questions for you in the chat. If you have some time to respond them in the chat, because we have limited time today and we will not have a formal space for questions and answers. But we'd love if you can answer some questions coming up. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you also, Rupert, as I can see you're already doing this. Thank you so much, Zaki. And let's move on to our next speaker. We have Tiwa Alewikun. Tiwa is a campaigner with Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change. This organization produces campaigns advocating for climate change through legal and human rights frameworks. Tiwa was involved in their major campaign to refer climate change to the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, by seeking an advisory opinion from the court on the issue of climate change and human rights. A major facet of his work is collecting climate impact stories from Tonga's outer islands to support submissions to the International Court of Justice. Welcome, Siwa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bianca. And Alexis and the rest of the facilitating team. Very excited to be here. I promise I will attempt to keep to my allocated time. But yes, thank you very much, everyone, for the invitation. I'm very keen to jump into this. As mentioned earlier, yes, my name is Shiwa, and I'm with Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, or PSFCC, or PSFCC. We are woefully aware of how long-winded the name is, but it's sort of stuck with us for the longest time. So, oh yes, next slide, please. Just a very brief overview of the content at the moment, the upcoming discussion points, introductions. Thank you. Next slide, please. One more. Apologies. This seems to be a different. Oh, okay. Not to worry. If it's okay with the facilitating team, can I just share my screen on my part? Apologies.
Great, thanks. Please share.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you. So just go over a very brief introduction of the beginnings of the campaign. I believe several people on the call have heard this origin story, and it's we've told it several times, and it's only because it's an origin we're very proud of. So back in 2019, in the University of the South Pacific, the way the university works is that different countries in the Pacific host specific schools of academia, and in Vanuatu, you have the School of Law. So in Vanuatu in 2019, there is a course that it's offered by the law program, which is International Environmental Law, and a group exercise for the entire class at the time, these 27 students, was to find a solution or find a contribution to fighting the climate crisis via international routes that isn't Paris or the UNFCCC. And the resulting answer from this group assignment was to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. That's a very brief insight into where it all began. I think something a bit more intimate is then taking this thought experiment, seemingly throwaway marks, and then turning it into a global movement. And I mentioned global movement because I think another worthwhile origin story to mention as well, because we also have one of our members from our sister organizations here, which is the establishment of World's Youth for Climate Justice, which is essentially the PSFCC, but for the rest of the world. And this was done in 2020 when PSFCC attended an international conference where they met like-minded youths from all around the world, and understanding that this movement demanded a global effort. These both organizations have collaborated ever since. So I'm just going to jump into a very quick AO 101. What is an advisory opinion? Why was this the solution sought by these 27 students? And essentially, an advisory opinion is just a legal answer to a legal question posed by the General Assembly or amongst other UN agencies. And the legal question that had been advocated for by by civil society at the time was, what are state obligations with regards to climate change? And in understanding that, that was the initial frame of the initial answer to the assignment question, was just to identify, or at least gain clarity from the ICJ on what are obligations from states. And in the spirit of other than Paris and UNFCCC, it was asking for obligations in the entire regime of international law. So things alongside, especially the human rights perspective or intergenerational equity, those were very core concepts in the initial stages of advocacy from the civil society orgs at the time. So an advisory opinion is essentially that. And in understanding this, the International Court of Justice practices are very state-focused. So civil society couldn't themselves couldn't bring this question to the court themselves. It had to be via a state. So the initial stages of advocating for this campaign was in identifying a country to sort of to shoulder this this burden. And if anyone here is aware of the history of Vanuatu's climate championing, they were sort of the what's the word for it? They were the go-to country for this. They have a long track record of supporting human rights movements in their Free West Papua campaigns. Very recently, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and the advocacy around that. But in 2019, the government was asked by the Pacific Youth to take on the Advise Your Opinion campaign, to which they did. And then something else worth mentioning is the invitation to civil society to also collaborate. And I want to just hone in on this one point, because I think one of the most one of the greatest achievements that this campaign has had, amongst a few others, is that dare we pat ourselves on the back, but providing a blueprint for what state and civil society collaboration can look like. It's, of course, got a great deal of transparency to do with, but there's also, for the states, it's taking a chance on civil society, taking a chance on their young people. And that's, of course, rooted in constant successful deliverables, of course, maintaining a very great level of professionalism across the board, just so that that risk that's taken by countries isn't lost or isn't made in vain. Sorry, I go on a quick tangent there, but that's essentially what the Advise Your Opinion and the legal question that was being advocated for. I will jump into the timeline a bit further down, but just some key themes, as I mentioned earlier, intergenerational equity, and of course, the role of human rights when responding to climate change. For those of you that often find themselves in the COP space or the SBs, you will be very accustomed with what these negotiation rooms look like, and the seemingly lack of the human rights or the human perspective in these rooms. And that was one of the attempts, because the legal question is also rooted in that. It's rooted in the aspects of future generation rights, and drawing from different, again, apart from Paris and UNFCCC, it draws from the rest of international law regime. And it is there that we find the hope that hopefully the ICJ will draw from other bodies of law and provide obligations for states that have yet to be brought to these negotiation rooms, shedding a light on the human perspective in these negotiation rooms that are often void of that. So why an advisory opinion? Why was this the worthwhile campaign that people provided their time and sacrifices towards? Of course, the UNFCCC multilateral spaces. There are, for those of you that are familiar with the negotiation rooms, there are seemingly very trivial matters in these negotiation rooms that take up so much space, from disagreements with regards to how something is phrased, or disagreements with which body of law to draw from when interpreting certain things. It's essentially the high-polluting states find great comfort in the ambiguity of law at the moment. And it is there where certain global south states with frontline communities find great difficulty, because there is no essentially red line from where everyone can sort of start from. And this is what the Advisory Opinion was attempting to do, and in its most base form was to provide clarity on what exactly obligations are. And then bringing that, of course, the idea was to eventually bring back this discussion to the UNFCCC spaces, or to multilateral processes in general. That's inclusive of the plastics negotiations, BB&J is finished now, but one of the other platforms this was envisioned for. And it is bringing that clarity so that advocacy can be rooted in substance, can be rooted in a definitive voice of the ICJ. And of course, climate litigation being the more obvious one. I think it was mentioned earlier in the chat as well. There was a recent decision in the Australia's federal court unsuccessfully dismissing a claim of duty of care breached by the Australian government. And that is one of the many examples of civil society or grassroots movements not having that definitive clarity from an international body that allows them to advocate on a bit more solid ground than just the domestic laws. It's providing legal clarity from the international space. What does collaboration look like in the international community based on a clear consensus on what the law says are obligations? And that was the thinking around climate litigation. How can this best assist active campaigns or active cases in courts at the moment and in future? Yes. Third, progressive and inclusive development of international law. We had always spoken about how this advisory opinion campaign is essentially a last-ditch effort from everyone from the Pacific for seeking this clarity in a space that's seemingly inconsiderate of global South countries, and being a part of that change, getting to dictate what that progression looks like and how inclusive this development is. This is why the Pacific and other global South states were great collaborators in this campaign. It's the attempt to be a part of that change and dictate its progression. Of course, cementing consensus on the science behind climate change. Something that we've learned, having spent time in this campaign for so long, is that the science or climate science is far ahead of law, in the sense that it is very much in alignment and is decided on what is causing climate change. The law, not so much, unfortunately. And the advisory opinion is seeking a clarity similar to the very recent ITLOS advisory opinion, where they do cement climate sciences in their advisory opinion. We're hoping for the same in the ICJ. The ICJ's advisory opinion, of course, provide baseline for state action on mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. I alluded to this earlier. And then a tool for achieving a more climate just world. I think this is those of you in civil society and grassroots movements, this is the more heartstringy point that we like to constantly remind ourselves of, is that this is for, similar to something Zaki alluded to earlier, this was never the attempt for a silver bullet or the solution to climate change, but rather a complement to existing efforts towards climate justice. And I've just provided this slide here. I wanted to go point by point, and these were, I think, the core to the success behind the ICJ advisory opinion campaign. Of course, several other things, but I wanted to highlight these 8 specifically. Building alliances. And of course, it seems like a very cliche thing to say. It's like you make friends in the space, collaborate. But there is a much more nuanced discussion behind that. It's the intentional, what's the word? It's the intentionally collaborating with the right persons and organizations, understanding that the goal is very much the same. It's climate justice. The means is where everyone varies, and it's in identifying where people or where organizations collide or collaborate, and then just becoming a more, bringing those movements together is essentially one of the ingredients for successful campaigning, especially at the international level. Very so often, several campaigns are after the same thing. They're after the same partners, they're after the same donors. And the goal is often set as a second priority, but it's an understanding where everyone sort of melds together. You can find success in moving forward. Regional and global events. Now, this may be a bit of a point of contention for several people, only because it very recently have these regional and global events have become a more 15 minutes of fame sort of thing, as opposed to attempting to achieve specific goals. But they aren't, they should be seen as the spirit is to not cede space. You are attending these regional and global events with the idea that you bring civil society's ambition to these spaces. So it's often at times people will tell you that COP isn't for civil society or Bonn isn't for civil society. But that's just because that's what it was before. And these voices that civil society bring, this ambition that civil society brings is often, more often than not, lacking in these spaces. Attending these, finding like-minded people, like-minded organizations, can often only be found in these regional collaborations, in these global events. Third to that, state engagement. And this is the part that I think, for myself personally, I found the greatest challenge in, because essentially you're inviting everyone to put on the diplomatic hat. It's a lot of ego stroking. It's a lot of speaking to countries that you know what they say in negotiation rooms. But it's how do you carry yourself? How do you carry your region? How do you carry your movements in these rooms? And state engagement, especially for those that want to work in the international space, you are required to have that diplomatic bone, to have that tolerance, but also to have that red line that civil society constantly brings to these discussions. It's going above and beyond for the communities you come from the movements you represent, and taking that to state engagement level, where these officials may or may not have any idea of where you're coming from or what initiatives you bring. And just finding the value in that diplomacy. There's that quote that the diplomacy doesn't work until it does. And it's not failed us since. The constant effort to collaborate with governments to speak speak alongside their communities, amplifying their voices. Media, this one, dare I go further on into this? Media, of course, we found great strength in working to what we are good at, and it's these outputs that civil society are far too familiar with. It's the digital media campaigns, finding the right video series to put out and constantly keep your community and the wider public aware of where the movement is, how they can support. It's essentially a big transparency exercise. And doing that with great intention and strategy really does have a great effect on the movement. It often goes unappreciated at times, but there is great strength in a well thought out strategic media campaign. Friends of the Initiative, fifth point. And I think this is a great consideration for movements just starting out. There is great value in having experts. And again, perhaps some of this goes unsaid, but it's worth delving into to understand why exactly these things are of use. So having government officials or the right spokespersons and experts really does help the initial stages of a campaign. Vying for endorsements in these international spaces can only be done because you have a certain persons supporting your campaign, and it's finding the right people, because we've had to learn the hard way that not everyone will be in alignment with your goals, or not everyone will have the right intentions going into supporting your campaign. And it's in identifying the right persons or the right organizations to essentially assist with that initial stage of advocacy that really does help the success further down the line. Direct action. This is the bread and butter of civil society. Sorry, go ahead, Clarissa.
Hi, so sorry to interrupt, but just to say, if you could finish up in the next few minutes, that would be great, so we can make sure Trina and Mariana have their
Oh,
time.
okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, definitely. Direct action, bread and butter of civil society. These are your actions, your peaceful protests. And this having a very coordinated, clearly intended actions really do assist a movement. Publications, this is where movements get to root their campaigns and dictate the narrative of their own movements, dictate the narrative of which their movements progress. And having these very well thought out, very well researched publications that are, of course, done with great intention, really do assist the campaign. And capacity building, very similar to the current training that you're all going through at the moment. It allows, and it's finding value in young people, taking a chance on young people, something that we are very, what's the word? We hold very dear to ourselves, to our hearts, because it's essentially where we've come from. It's young people taking a chance on a system that's not worked for them and their peoples. And it's governments that have taken chance that require the capacity building element to your movements. Quickly go through some very quick milestones. So 4 years of campaigning, we found ourselves at the unanimous adoption of the legal question I discussed earlier. The court phase was the entirety of last year, March 2024, written submission. So this is when the ICJ invites UN states to provide written submissions on the legal question. Then there was a comments and written submissions phase in June of last year, where governments then get to comment on each other's submissions. And then the oral submissions, which is when states essentially appeared before the court and provided their final testimony before judges started drafting the advisory opinion. And these are just a few of the contributions that PSFCC and World Youth for Climate Justice were able to give into the interstate submissions phase. And then just what is up next? For those of you that aren't aware, the advisory opinion will be delivered on the 23rd of this month, that is next Wednesday at 3 p.m. In The Hague. And this is the culmination of essentially 6 years of work, not just by ourselves and World Youth for Climate Justice, but for several other civil society organizations and experts and communities that have been advocating for this at different levels. And we will see that come to fruition. What success there is, I hate to speculate at this moment, but yes, we will see that in a week's time. We have a big tent mobilization called the attempt to bring together all efforts towards mobilizing them towards the delivery. If there's interest, please do reach out. And then the post-delivery analysis is a closed group session amongst trusted partners to essentially dissect the advisory opinion as soon as it drops. And hopefully we can have a public event where we, and this is an attempt to dictate the narrative around what the advisory opinion means, what the civil society take away from this. And then there will be a public event to hopefully inform our audience and community members of what the advisory opinion means for them specifically. Thank you very much. Apologies for taking too much time. I pass it back to you, Clarissa.
Thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. And yeah, the work that's been done around that advisory opinion is amazing. So thank you for all your work on that. I'm now going to introduce our last two speakers. I'll introduce them together because they're going in short succession and work together. So Trina Tiemi is a founding co-chair of Fast Action on Climate to Ensure Intergenerational Justice, which is the FACE Intergenerational Justice Project. They're also a research associate at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development and a JD candidate at Vermont Law School. Their research and advocacy focuses on using law and policy to ensure intergenerational climate justice, particularly through near-term climate mitigation. Trina led FACE's youth amicus submission before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on its advisory opinion request on the climate emergency and human rights. And I can see some people asking about this advisory opinion in the chat, so you'll be happy to hear about it. I'm going to introduce Mariana as well, so that Trina, you can hand over directly. Mariana Campos is the Latin American Front Coordinator for World's Youth for Climate Justice, a global youth-led campaign seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. Mariana led WYCJ's participation in the Inter-American Court's hearings on the advisory opinion on the climate emergency and represented the organization at COP28 and COP29. And today they're going to talk to us about that Inter-American Court of Human Rights advisory opinion. So I'll hand it straight over to you guys. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much to the organizing team and also to Trina, because I'm here because of you. Thank you so much. We are witnessing a historic moment for climate justice, not only in Latin America, but globally. This past July 3rd, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights published its long-awaited advisory opinion on the climate emergency and human rights. And what does this mean, and why is it relevant not only for Latin America, but for the world as a whole? Well, an advisory opinion is an authoritative legal interpretation issued by the judges of the Inter-American Court in this particular case, regarding a state's obligations under international law on a particular subject. In this instance, Chile and Colombia asked the court, broadly speaking, what states' obligations are in relation to the climate emergency, taking into account the disproportionate harm suffered by vulnerable groups, including youth, children, and even future generations. The Inter-American Court had already paved the way somewhat regarding states' obligations related to the right to a healthy environment. In its 2017 advisory opinion, the court recognized that this right is held both individually, that is, you and I experience it from our own circumstances, and collectively, for example, as humanity, as a community, or as a group experiencing particular impacts. We have a collective interest in this right. And why is this decision historic? It is the first time that a regional human rights court, through an advisory opinion, has recognized that the climate crisis is a threat to human rights, framing it as an emergency and clarifying that states must act now in accordance with international human rights law. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And as Sula was speaking before, this is part of a much broader movement in which the law is being used to clarify states' obligations regarding climate change, and especially the consequences of failing to meet those obligations. For example, the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea issued its advisory opinion on May 21st of last year. The Inter-American Court released its opinion this month, the 3rd of July of this year. And thanks to the initiative of the Pacific Youth and Global Mobilization, the International Court of Justice will also deliver its advisory opinion on July 23rd of this month. All eyes on the World Court next week. And finally, the African Court on Human Rights and People's Rights has also received a request to clarify these obligations and will publish its own opinion soon. All of these processes have been closely followed by civil society, which has played a significant role in contributing to the development of international law. But the process before the Inter-American Court, sorry, I just noticed that I don't have the video. I don't know why I can.
Mariana, it's just because your signal is breaking up quite a bit, so we just took off the video to
okay.
improve the connection.
Thank you. I thought that it was me because of me, but Thank you so much. So all of these processes have been closely followed by civil society, but this process in particular was participatory from the very beginning. Not only states could submit arguments for the court's consideration, but also NGOs, indigenous nations, trade unions, scientists, children, and youth were able to send written arguments and even participate in oral hearings so that the judges could hear firsthand the different perspectives of these groups. The court received over 263 written observations and traveled to Barbados and Manaus, Brazil to listen to people living in areas heavily affected by the climate crisis. What were the court's conclusions in general? Well, that the climate emergency has an intrinsic link with the protection of human rights, since a healthy environment and the climate system in particular as one of its components are preconditions for the enjoyment of other human rights. Along these lines, the court recognized rights for nature itself, as its cycles and ecosystems are vital for the existence of present and future generations, as well as for other species. And therefore, the court recognized the right to a healthy climate, the legal obligation to prevent harm, and that measures must be effective, urgent, and equitable. It also establishes that there are differentiated and special obligations for the protection of children, youth, and future generations. So I will now pass the voice to Trina to
Thank you,
follow
Mariana.
this. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I recognize we have 5 minutes left, so I will kind of skip some things, but I think because the audience is primarily young people, I really wanted to highlight some of the general obligations that the Inter-American Court identified regarding mitigation, but also the rights of current and future generations, and then also what this means for future cases in the region and beyond. So some of the general obligations that the court declared is the obligation to respect and guarantee rights, which includes an application of this thing called reinforced due diligence. So that means having very proactive, ambitious, and preventative measures to avoid the worst of climate scenarios, using the best available science to help design and implement these kinds of actions. And all of this has to be integrated with a human rights lens, or really rooted in human rights. The other elements that the court identified is the obligation to progressively realize the economic, social, and cultural rights. This includes the obligation to use the maximum available resources, particularly for the most vulnerable communities. And also this duty of non-retrogression is also mentioned by the court, where any regression must be justified, scientifically based, and proportionate. There's also an obligation to adopt domestic legal reforms based on what the Inter-American Court had found. So aligning national law with international obligations. So under this thing called the doctrine of conventionality control in the Inter-American Court, all public authorities of members of the Organization of American States, they need to make sure that their laws and actions follow human rights law. And so states have to comply with how the court interprets what is written under the OAS. And then also the obligation to cooperate internationally under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the mitigation obligations derives from the court unanimously declaring that states have a legal obligation to respond to the climate emergency through urgent, effective, and equitable mitigation and adaptation measures. So this is from the duty to protect substantive rights to life, health, healthy environment, and as Mariana said, a healthy climate. And so what the court requires, says that states are obligated to do is set ambitious and binding targets based on current and historical emissions and aligned with the 1.5-degree guardrail. Regulating corporate behavior to make sure that human rights are respected, but also making sure that states are supervising, monitoring, and making transparent the actions of polluting corporations. And this also includes investigations, judgments, and sanctions to make sure that non-compliant entities are also having justice as well. The other piece of it is to reduce emissions and protect nature. And so the court realized that states have to develop and update a human rights-based mitigation strategy. And so to prevent harm, states have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This can also include emissions of what's called short-lived climate pollutants like methane. They also say that states have to protect nature and adopt a strategy for sustainable development. And this also is under this reinforced due diligence standard, which is based on the best available knowledge, which includes access to the best available science, but also access to local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge, and also guided by the principle of prevention. Another piece of this is conducting climate impact assessments. And so this has to consider the best available science, including the irreversible nature of climate impacts, and lead to a mitigation plan. So there's a lot more. We'll make sure to share the PowerPoint with you all, but we wanted to talk a little bit in the last minute here about what this means. So this court connects climate action to the broader goal of peace. Even the Pontifical Academy of Sciences praised this opinion's humanist approach, but also nature-based approach as well. And so by addressing the climate emergency through human rights, we are contributing to a more stable and peaceful world. The court says it's not enough to focus solely on mitigation. States also have to take measures to address the structural circumstances that lead to the climate emergency and also require building resilience to deal with the effects and impacts. Specifically, the court noted that delaying climate action shifts an unjustifiable burden onto future generations, which is incompatible with international human rights obligations. There's definitely a lot more that we could say on this, but I will conclude now because we have not much time yet, but we'll make sure to follow up. There is going to be a brief that FACE and World Youth for Climate Justice will be producing on the specific findings of the court regarding future generations, since I wasn't really able to touch on that much today. But yeah, thank you so much for giving us the space and opportunity to talk about it. It's a very exciting time to really utilize the law to see what we can do.
Thank you so much for that amazing whistle-stop tour, and thank you for keeping it to time. I know your time got a bit squeezed, but it's just been such good timing for this session with your advisory opinion just coming out recently and the ICJ advisory opinion coming out next week. So yeah, everyone on the call who is interested, please look into these in more details. And like Trina said, we will be sharing the slides so you can read more about the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We have a few final logistical bits, but first of all, just a massive thank you to the speakers. Honestly, such amazing presentations on all counts. And yeah, I can tell everyone really enjoyed them. I'm just gonna share my screen quickly. So the main thing we wanted to remind you about is the bursary applications. We're hoping that lots of you are writing these at the moment. The deadline is next Monday, July 21st, but we really want to hear from as many of you as possible. Even if you don't feel experienced, even if you feel nervous, this is your opportunity and we encourage everyone to go for it. There's a lot of information in the web form and the sheets we sent out with the eligibility criteria and also advice on how to craft a strong application. So please just look into that and I'm sure your application will be great, but we want to hear from as many of you as possible. The other thing that I'm anticipating we're going to get lots of questions about is certificates. So first things first, we won't be processing those until probably the end of September. please don't ask in the meantime because we'll be focusing on the bursary. And so before September, you won't be hearing about certificates. But one thing we did want to do is we know we've been asking you to do a lot of forms to get your certificates. So in recognition of just how many there's been and to make it as easy as possible for everyone to get a certificate, we're reopening all the forms until the end of this week, Sunday, the 20th of July. We'll send links to all of them in a big email. But as a reminder, there's 3 types of things you need to fill out. There's that original onboarding form, which most people filled out, so I think we're good. There's the attendance forms from each session, and there's the bond assignment, and that had 2 forms. If you're not sure, you can resubmit because you have candidate numbers, we'll know it's assigned to you. So I've had some questions about people who were worried they didn't get a high enough score. We will be very, very generous with scores, so don't worry. But if you do want to resubmit, that's okay. But please just do submit those forms so we can get your certificates to you. And then the final thing is just that we will be having a reunion session in November. Much more details to come nearer the time, but this will be a session about fostering a community for the long term and also in preparation for COP, which hopefully we'll see some of you there. So save the date for November 4th at the same time as always. And that's the end of the program, really. So just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining and for bringing all your amazing questions. Honestly, watching the chat every session is always my favorite bit. So such a big thank you. And I really hope you've got something out of it. Alexis or Bianca, did you want to add any final words before we go?
Just thanks so much, everyone. It's been amazing to have you from the moment that we looked at your applications through till now. It's been a really special journey. So thank you so much for being a part of this training. And we have breakout rooms, optional breakout rooms, if you'd like to join us. I'll hand it to Bianca for the last word.
Thank you so much to all of you for your insights, for your learning process, to share your learning process with us. We are really happy to have you all here in this program, in this 2025 edition. Thank you so much, Alexis, also Clarissa, and all of our speakers for today. It was amazing session. Thank you so much.
Thanks so
Cool.
much.
And
I'm sorry,
now-
I did say Bianca had the last word, but I remembered one thing, which is that in a few weeks' time or in a month's time or so, you'll get a feedback form where we'll ask you some feedback on the sessions, how they were structured, and particularly to get a testimony from you, which we would love to be able to use in promotional materials. We're actively fundraising for future editions of the program, and it really helps us to have quotes that say that this was valuable to you. So if you could fill those out when they come in a few weeks' time, that would be really sincerely appreciated. Okay, over to you, Clarissa.
Yeah, just that I totally was going to wrap up the session there, but we do have optional breakout rooms. So I've just opened those to give everyone some time to chat about the session, reflect on what they've learned in the whole training. And I've also just seen in the chat people maybe want a group photo, so we can do that after the breakout rooms. But hopefully you know the drill by now. Breakout rooms, there's an icon at the bottom of your screen that's 4 squares. If you can't see that, you might need to click on 3 dots that say more. Alexis, is that a legacy hand, or did you want to come in?
Oh no, just about the group photo, but it is a legacy hand, but I think it'd be nice.
Cool, yeah. Think group pick post group photo. Sorry, group pick post breakout groups.
Maybe just now, in case people
Yeah,
need to go.
now. Okay, everyone's here. Let's do it now. Cool. I'm going to do the group pick. If you don't want to be in it, then turn off your camera. If you do want to be in it, then smile. Keep smiling because there's lots of screens. Keep smiling because there's lots of screens. Okay, we're all done. Thanks, everyone. And now be free to break out rooms.